Perfect. And I am back with you. Okay. Good morning, Councillor Bradford. How are you doing today?
Doing good. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for reaching out.
Perfect. So let's dive right into it because our webinars are usually short. I want to start from the grand vision. Okay. In the past 4 years, obviously we had a pandemic, but we had some really great initiatives such as Cafetio, live music on patios, and Destination Danforth. And all of those really help to create more of walkable neighborhoods, really attractive and desirable neighborhoods. What is next? What do you think the city could, what are the other initiatives do you think we can lean on?
Well, I think when we look at the past 4 years, and obviously, that's been characterized by a global pandemic, we've really seen opportunities for government to reinvent itself. We've seen the best of government. We've seen a whole of government sort of response to the challenges that we've been facing. And you identified a number of the programs that we've been able to roll out that have really transformed the way we think about public space and we're using public space. And so Cafe TO is obviously the best example of that. And it was a response to, of course, finding ways to support our local businesses, providing a new lifeline for our mom and pop shops, animating our streets in a way I think many of us have hoped for a long time. And we point to other cities and jurisdictions around the world and we say, why can't we have that here in Toronto? And what I find is so often we have these overarching policy objectives, strong, vibrant main streets, walkable communities, and yet a lot of the process that we have in place presents barriers to those outcomes. So with the global pandemic, it required us to engage in fresh thinking, to sort of throw out all of the existing rules, rewrite the playbook, and find ways to use these spaces. You saw that in Active TO, the amplified music on patios. And I think, when we reflect on that, which was a pandemic response, I think, the idea of going back to sort of the status quo is not going to be palatable for a lot of us. And these programs have shown us that we can try new things and we can break the rules, and actually the sky's not going to fall. It's going to be okay. And we're left with really fantastic main streets.
I live in Adelaide, so between Queen and King, and Cafetio, you were just walking downtown and you say, wow, this is what Toronto wanted to be. And all of a sudden it became, it became a beautiful city. I totally agree with you.
Well, and it's also like people often forget that our streets are in fact the largest public space network that we have in the city. You always think about the parks, and we have a lot of fantastic parks too, but our streets represent that largest public realm, public space network. So, Toronto was designed in many respects and engineered with sort of the 1970s notion of how do we move as many single occupancy vehicles as quickly as possible. And yet now we're 3 million people and we continue to grow, and that's not working anymore. So as the pandemic's shown us, a lot of folks are working remotely in different capacities. Those trips become hyper local. We're making conscientious efforts to shop locally, to spend time in our neighborhoods. And it's not a transaction of like, from the neighborhoods to downtown and then back home every day. It's much more fluid. And so our thinking and the way that we make use of these spaces needed to change too. And I think it's a change for the positive.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going back 2018. Missing middle was rarely a thing. I was talking to my friend who's been a planner for over 20 years. He said, you now take it for granted. 20 years ago, no one even dreamed it's going to be something, right? No one even realized it's a problem. 2022, not only that it's a thing, it's a very popular concept. You hear, one of the few words that, the public knows, understands. What's your vision for, 2026? How the missing middle is going to look like in 4 years?
Well, in short, I hope that we're not having this conversation, in 4 years about missing middle. I hope that the middle has been found and been realized, and it's ubiquitous across 640 square kilometers here in Toronto. But, you have to go back a little bit in history. Our history as a big amalgamated city, you go back to 20 years ago, the sort of consolidated official plan and the effort to land that. And, Paul Bedford, our fantastic chief planner at the time, And the deal that was really struck with residents associations, the grand bargain, as he describes it, where, the appeal was, let's direct the density to the avenues, let's direct the density to the urban centers, and we'll leave the neighborhoods alone. And certainly the thinking at the time was that would accommodate the growth that we were anticipating to come to the city. But 2 decades on, we have seen that in the North American context, Toronto has been a leader for growth. We are a magnet for talent. There's a tremendous amount of investment. People want to come here. We want people to come here. And the idea that it's all going to be accommodated in a mid-rise form on our avenues or in our centers hasn't really materialized. And for like a lot of different reasons, and that makes sense. But I think the pressures and the demands that we're experiencing today are certainly eclipsing the supply that we have. And that is a huge contributor to the affordability crisis. And, in summary, I think about, I'm 35 myself, 1986 model. And, when you make the median income in the city of Toronto, $69,000, $70,000 a year, and you can't afford to live here, that is a huge challenge for our future prosperity, our future success, and our future sustainability as a city. And that is why now more than ever, it is so imperative that we address this. And I think the notion of gentle density, unlocking the yellow belt, removing exclusionary zoning, unleashing the missing middle, all of that, whatever you want to call it, the idea of adding incremental more density in our neighborhoods is so critical. So 2026, certainly we can't sit on our hands for the next 4 years. This has to be done. It has to be addressed, and it has to be built. You have to be able to look outside your window, walk through the neighborhoods, and start to see that transformation in a real tangible way. We can get into the sort of nuts and bolts and mechanics of that because there's a ton of pieces that need to kind of come together, but that work's underway. We're piloting it in Beaches East York. We're going to come up with a template and a model, really unpack, the zoning side of that, but more importantly, the whole development review process that would either facilitate or inhibit that, build a new model, and then roll it out at scale across the city. And certainly by 2026, we need to see that as the new norm, as a new norm of building more housing, more opportunities for more people in more neighborhoods.
Music to my ears. I'm taking that missing middle line and continue with it. So I heard you say several times that affordability and sustainability are the two aspects that we need, the two lenses for housing in the future. Some would say that affordability and sustainability are two contradictory aspects of housing. Maybe not necessarily, but what's your angle on that?
Well, I think there's no like one size of affordability, and that means different things to different people. And as you know, and we, in your work and had these conversations before, that the affordability is important across the entirety of the housing continuum. So there's no like silver bullet one thing that we need to do on housing. We need to do all the things. And that's from respite to shelter to supportive housing to affordable rental to affordable market to market, and everything in between. And the missing middle, or laneway suites, or garden suites, or point towers, or mid-rise, duplexes, triplexes, quads, all of these sort of things fit into different components on the housing continuum. So the affordability piece, we need good, stable jobs. We need pathways to prosperity. We need to address the precarious nature of work. And we need to make sure that all of the talent that we're attracting, the new immigration that's coming to this country, of which the vast majority is settling in the GTHA, that we have housing options for all those people who are coming here and for people who would, like to stay here. Because that's a big piece of this as well, that whether it's seniors, our parents who would like to stay and age in the community, they don't necessarily, want to go into long-term care. We want them to have more autonomy. That's about the walkability. That's about the complete communities having the things in the neighborhoods that support long life and aging in place. And as well as kids, as well as, young adults who would like to move out of the sort of family home or apartment. But right now there's not a lot of options for them to do that. So like that is the affordability piece. There's a lot that we could talk about, programs at other levels of government, things that the city is able to do, expediting our approval process so that we're reducing financing costs and the time in which it takes to get projects approved into the market and actually built. Like that's a big piece of affordability that's often lost. And then the sustainability side, like sustainability, we can talk about that writ large in terms of, environmental impact, more sustainable cities. People talk to me about Transform TO, which is sort of our climate change program here in the city of Toronto. But first and foremost, and you know this very well, the most sustainable thing that we can do, as a species, of course, is live in urban environments, live in environments where, walking is a real option for you, where transit can be ubiquitous all day, all direction, and you can take transit or active transportation, reducing those commuting patterns, because we know that transportation, aside from housing, is the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's that sustainability side. But then I would say more, writ large, the sustainability of Toronto's future success and prosperity. And that gets back to the piece about, if we don't have stable, dignified housing options for folks in this city, then Toronto's future success will not be sustainable. You have to take care of that, is the first fundamental. Housing and mobility. Those are the two things that unlock prosperity and opportunities for economic advancement. So we have to take care of that off the top.
And speaking about affordability, in less than a month, we have the provincial elections. And in earlier this year, they released the report by the Affordability Task Force, sorry. And, I reviewed it as a professional, and sorry to say, but there was nothing new in there that the professional industry didn't know. And I'm saying this to you as a professional first and an urban planner, as a politician secondly. How did you review this report? What did you think about it? What do you think was, implementable? How do you think it's going to affect the election? Do you think they're going to adopt it seriously?
I think, politics, and the joke is planning is politics, and we've all heard that. But a lot of politicians, particularly in smaller metros or municipalities, would not necessarily be familiar with the dynamics of the market, would not necessarily be familiar with the challenges of actually building housing and bringing that online for people. And you could have a conversation about affordability writ large, and people could say, oh, affordable housing is a real challenge. But when you start getting into the mechanics, the nuts and bolts, trying to unpack that, there's a big disconnect. There's a big disconnect between, the civil service, the professional class of people who work in this space, the politicians who are largely providing the direction to staff or building the policies, and then the electorate or average citizens. They don't necessarily care about all of the nuts and bolts of how to make it happen, but they know that, their aging parents don't have a place that they can move into in the neighborhood, or they think about their kids in the context of like, oh my goodness, how are my kids going to afford somewhere to live in the city? Whether that's Toronto or really anywhere in the GTHA, those problems exist, across the board. So the task force, it was largely a professional panel, professionals in the housing space and the finance space and the development space that were providing input and recommendations to the government. And I think a lot of those recommendations were actually really good. Maybe they were things that you and I had seen and had heard and had experienced as we'd work in that space. But for that to go to government, I think is actually a really powerful body of work. And there was a lot of good ideas in there. Some of them were much more abstract. Some of them probably, won't have legs because there may not be the political will or leadership to implement them. But there was a lot of good stuff there that, if it was taken seriously and it was implemented, would, in my view and estimation, translate into real results in terms of bringing more housing online more easily for folks. And that's what it's all about. I was underwhelmed with what was actually brought forward out of the task force. And I think that a lot of us were, and there was a lot of disappointment in all of those great ideas. And then what actually came forward pre-election, was underwhelming. But, there is a political lens to this. And I think that you saw, frankly, to be very candid with everyone here, a lot of pushback from municipalities across the province who were just not on board for that. And I think, folks got weak in the knees as we approach a provincial election, which is going to be really important for, existing and incumbent MPPs and folks who want to become MPPs. And that's the problem with political leadership. And it's not just a provincial thing, it's a federal thing, and it is definitely a municipal thing, because in my 3.5 years in this job, I could see that probably the biggest impediment to actually getting housing done, to unleashing the supply and the transformations that we need, the biggest challenge is local governments. and you have way too many councillors who are willing to bend the knee and acquiesce to, every particular residence group or association that mobilizes the same folks that show up in the bottom of the church basement every time to tell you, no, we're not on board with that, or, we support affordable housing, but we don't support it here. That's too high. This is too tall, too much density. And there's a real disconnect between the issues which we can all articulate around affordable housing and the change that is going to be necessary to address the magnitude of the problem that's facing us. Huge disconnect. So politicians get weak in the knees. I think it's the worst at local government level, which is why a lot of those tools, that the province is bringing forward, I think, frankly, they're the first government to sort of own it and recognize that local governments have historically been a challenge, to impeding that progress. Now, the provincial government wears some of that too, and it's provincial governments of successive stripes. It's not like this just was something that has happened in the past 4 years. There was a previous government with a history of that, and this government has shown that, they're not always on the right side of those issues every time when it comes to MZOs and our ability to deliver those things too. So in general, I think that there was a lot of good stuff in there. I think that after the election, whichever party forms government, they should take a look at that body of work that was done, because there's a lot of good stuff there. And I think the thing that we can all feel confident about, or hopeful or aspirational, is that all of the four parties have brought forward housing policies and platforms that are central to what they're talking about. And there's each party has some good stuff in there, some better than others, but there's some good stuff in there. And I think it is a central part of this election and what we're talking about. Affordability, writ large, and housing. Those two are related, but everybody's talking about it. So, hopefully on the other side of this thing, we can get back to work, get back to government, and see some bigger changes forward.
That was provincial policy. Now let's talk about municipal policy. Recently, the Danforth Design Guidelines, or the Danforth study, for the first time ever said, let's revisit angular planes. And just for the sake of the audience, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Angular planes is a tool to dictate the height of and build form of mid-rise buildings and tall buildings. In the study was specifically about the mid-rise buildings along the Danforth, which result in, CBC called it the wedding cake, and I'm sure many people refer to it as that, but it's basically setbacks and stepbacks by every floor. And I was on a panel with the chief planner, Greg Linton, this Saturday, that the way he said it, the way he put it was that this study is going to open opportunities to revisit angular plane as a tool as a whole. And I know you made a request that the guidelines that were specifically in this study will be applicable worldwide to Ward 19. Tell me more. I want to hear more about it. I don't even have a question. Just tell me more.
Yeah. I mean, this is a sort of we have these planning values, we have planning policies, and many of them have been with us for a long time, and they are almost viewed as, some sort of untouchable notions, or things that angular plane is sacrosanct, and we can't deviate from that in the Toronto context. And yet look around the world, look at other cities. There are lots of other jurisdictions where the notion of angular plane is not part of the practice in planning in those cities. And I'm not saying that there's no rule for angular plane, and that we don't have to have, consideration for setbacks and adjacencies, that stuff's not important. But it comes down to how do we balance all of these competing interests? And I know that, if there's anyone who's ever gone through a development review, application circulation process, we can have, in fact, competing comments from, urban design, heritage, and forestry, all saying contradicting sort of things, and an applicant or a proposal needs to resolve those. And it's a source of great frustration. Similarly here, from a policy perspective, if we're talking about, the housing crisis and affordability crisis, those are the big issues that this council political leadership and our civil service are trying to address. And then we put on all of these different layers and requirements and restrictions that, it's a death by a thousand cuts. It slowly whittles away at our ability to unleash housing, to unleash affordability, to deliver on that proposition of a sustainable future for everybody going forward. So, Angular Plane, I think rightly, in the context of, Danforth Avenue, building and development on $1 billion higher order transit subway line, where we, in many instances, have 2 stories existing today. You start layering on all of those sacrosanct planning policies from decades past, and it becomes very difficult and challenging to actually deliver affordable units in a mid-rise context on an avenue, on a subway, in one of the fastest growing cities on the continent. And so what we are doing as, politicians and our chief planner, Greg Lintern, and others, is it's sort of a recognition that times have changed. We need to align our planning policies with our broader overarching city policy objectives. And rather than having those as 2 sort of competing interests, our policies and our policy objectives, we need to align those and make sure that they are working in concert to deliver on the promise of more affordable housing, more housing options, and in particular in a case like Danforth, where you're sitting on $1 billion of subway infrastructure. So, what we did was recognizing that this study began in earnest back in 2014. I think 2014 doesn't sound that long ago. I think some people may be driving cars that are still, that old, and so it's not that long ago, and yet the world has changed so dramatically. And the affordability pressures in the city when it comes to housing have just had this exponential pressure. So we, as policymakers, as folks who are working in this space, our policies have to evolve to sort of match that challenge. And I think doing away with, or at least not taking this sacrosanct, untouchable approach to shadow or to angular plane, is a really important step, where we're going to provide applicants more affordability to, have a more conventional envelope without the wedding cake taper, in an effort to deliver more affordable units in such an important part of our city.
2014, that's the year I moved to Canada, and to Toronto, and I can tell you that when we moved here, that, believe it or not, people just laugh at me when I say that, but Toronto was our affordable option. We moved here from Tel Aviv, which cost of living is unbearable.
Right.
And in those 8 years, we just, the change that the city has had in terms of affordability and becoming less and less affordable is just unbelievable. So I can attest to that. We're getting some really interesting questions from the audience. So, and we're getting a question about development charges, and development charges is an obstacle to building the missing middle. And it's really interesting because when clients talk to me about development charges, I said you shouldn't be worried about development charges when the process takes so long. You will be paying way more in fees and property tax and whatnot than, how many units in the missing middle, of course, not mid-rise and tall buildings. And now I saw the graph on development charges, and it looks like this, right? Development charges and building the missing middle. What are we going to see there?
Well, I think that as policymakers, we need to be able to provide a nuanced and refined approach to things like municipal finance, and that it's not necessarily a one size fits all when we're talking about municipal finance. And municipal finance and taxation is very difficult, and there are requirements, as it relates to the province and in different tax bands and our ability to sort of parse that out. But I think it's a problem that requires, more of a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. And if we have policy objectives about unlocking certain types of development, then, would we treat a, 6-unit multiplex sort of building or triplex in a neighborhood as a 60-story tower, both from a development review process, but also from a DC or parkland dedication approach? And I think what you're going to see in the Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhood EHON report is a recognition that For many years, we've had a sort of static one size fits all approach to development charges, to development review. And we have to ask ourselves the question as government and as city builders, does that make sense? Is there the same sort of staff burden into reviewing these sort of applications? Is the same sort of extensive circulation and commenting process with development review required for what could be a building that effectively has the same envelope as a single detached house, but now contains 3 units? And on the municipal finance side and the development review side, if you treat that as such, if you treat that the same as a 60-story building, it all of a sudden becomes incredibly burdensome, incredibly time consuming, and the projects aren't viable. And that's why, it goes back to a misalignment of our policies and our objectives and the process to sort of get there. That's why we don't see this development taking place. Well, there's a lot of reasons, but that's one of them. So I think as it relates to the DC piece, which are intended to be cost recovery. I know that there's a mandated review on timelines on when we look at DCs, and it's supposed to be a cost recovery basis. We need to be understanding what is the actual cost, from a city perspective of administering the review and the staff that are required to go through these types of applications, and also the strain on services, and community amenities that comes forward with these development, and the notion that development pays for development. Let's be honest, there's a lot of neighborhoods in Toronto that are actually experiencing population decline. And when we talk about taxation and property taxes, and that's sort of a separate bucket, but people always point to Toronto as being #low tax city. But we also benefit from, being a city that's existed for over a century, where we do have a lot of existing infrastructure, which requires upgrading, and state of good repair and expansion as we grow. But you compare it to greenfield municipalities like, King Township, that's all new. And they got to build all the community centers, and they got to build all the schools. So, there is a certain massive inertia that the city of Toronto carries forward. And I guess the real comment is we need to be more nuanced. We need to think about what the actual costs are, and a one size fits all or blanketed approach to DCs or taxation or parkland dedication doesn't necessarily make sense. I think it needs to be done at a neighborhood level, depending on where the neighborhoods are. And we need to come up with something for the different size and scale of development that we're going to see in the future.
Okay, we're getting more and more questions. I missed one question. Can you, the first one, the Beaches Missing Middle pilot, can you tell us more?
Yeah, I know a lot of folks get frustrated about the pilot approach that we take here in the city of Toronto, but I would just, in government, we've got 3 million people in this city, and your hand's kind of on the throttle of progress, and you have to bring people along. You have to build coalitions of support, even on the staff side. You got to get the civil service on side, get everybody rowing in the same direction. So while pilots are incremental and sometimes frustrating and slow, they do move us in the right direction. And the idea is, when you take a pilot, whether it's Danforth bike lanes that we did here in Beaches East York, or this missing middle pilot, you build something, you work out the kinks, you figure out what doesn't work and what does work, and then you have the ability to deploy that at scale across the city. So that's what we're doing. We're in the process of identifying sites. We have identified sites that hasn't been released yet, but the city will then go out to market, working with the building community, working with universities, not-for-profits, institutions to come up with a design, and then effectively tender somebody to build this. We'll do an affordable housing project here and build a template for missing middle. This is what it could look like. And then the idea, of course, is going forward to be able to deploy that across the city. So you'll hear more about that in the months ahead. I can't get into all of the details, but it is that idea of build it here, show people what it looks like, build coalitions of support for it, and really dispel a lot of the myths associated with what gentle density could look like. That we're, dispel the notion that we're blowing up the neighborhoods and that this is going to be a bad thing. Because again, you go back to our shared values of talking about affordability for seniors, for kids, for everybody, a city to live in. Everybody gets that. What it looks like and how it materializes across the city, that is yet to be determined. And for folks who are not in this webinar, it can be really abstract. So there is a lot of power in showing and demonstrating what it looks like. And that's how you build people's trust. And we can only make progress at the speed in which we build trust. So pilots are an important part of that. we'll get it done here in Beaches East York, and then we'll roll it out across the rest of the city.
To be honest, we're getting more and more questions. However, our webinars are 30 minutes long to make it more doable for you to join us in your busy days. And I want to respect that. And I want to respect your, I'm sure, busy day, Councillor Bradford. I'm sure your team took notes of these incredible questions, because they're some of the, they're very, very smart questions. I want to thank you for finding the time and joining our community and talking about these issues. And thank you very much for that discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nema, and all the work that you do in facilitating this, and everybody's on here because you're hosting it, and we appreciate all the work that you do in Toronto. And folks, I'd love to engage, and we'll find other forums to do that. And thanks for helping us move this city forward, everybody together. Appreciate it. Love the design community. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Thank you.